Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 53, and we're going to talk about government in religion. That is the governmental structure of recognized religious organizations. But first, we're going to talk about Victoria Nuland in Niger. Right. So Victoria Nuland is the Deputy Secretary of State of the United States, and she went to Niger. I used to call it Niger, right? Like when we were kids, we were taught to pronounce it Niger. But if you want to talk about the people who live in Niger, you would call them Nigerians. But there's already a country, Nigeria, and we already call those people Nigerians. And since Niger never made the news until recently, no one really seemed to care. And so now that we have to talk about the people who live in Niger, we're going to use the French pronunciation, Niger. And then the people who live there are the Nigerois. And my French is not very good. And so if I butchered that, I apologize. But anyway, so Nuland went there to basically tell them that their coup was illegal unless Nuland is doing it. And of course, if you know your recent American history, Victoria Nuland was the one that orchestrated the coup in Ukraine in 2014. People have many different kinds of, different ways of describing it. But if you can see the unfolding events here in Niger, you can see that Nuland did the same exact thing in Ukraine. She didn't like what was going on in that country. And so she put into power, basically, a comedian who plays the piano with his genitals, right? So there you have it. So anyway, so she says, don't take help from Russia, don't let the Wagner group into the country, and restore power to the previous dictator so that you can continue to allow France and the United States to pillage the country, right? Which is essentially what the previous dictator was doing. And if they don't do that, then the United States will withhold money from them, right? And this is standard operating procedures, SOP, of the United States when it comes to disobedient countries. We'll withhold our dollars from you. And of course, Niger said, don't care, keep your money. French have been trying to help us out for decades, and we're still all poor, while all those other people that set up all those mining companies in this country are getting rich. Something is not right. And so they said, don't care. We'll do fine without you. And so obviously, since France gets most of its uranium from Niger, as well as gold and other minerals and commodities, this is very upsetting. That's why a lot of countries are pressuring other African countries to start a war with Niger, right? And the United States also has a huge drone base there. So drones, I guess, that fly over the Middle East even, they take off from Niger. So it's kind of interesting. So that aspect is generally not talked about in the news. But why is it significant, and why am I taking up 4 minutes of time in this episode to talk about it? Well, because in decades past, when a country started getting uppity like this, the United States would bomb them, okay? But since the United States used up all of its ammunition in the Ukraine, they have nothing with which they can bomb the Nigerois, right? And a lot of people in the world, not just people like me, perceive the weakness of America militarily, politically, economically, intellectually, right? And so they're becoming emboldened to basically show America the hand, right? Speak to the hand, because the face does not understand, right? So anyway, that's, I think, is a very significant development. So let's talk about the government in religion. Now, if you talk about government in religion, people generally will go to separation of church and state. And we talked about this in episode 7, but briefly, I'll just review. Separation of church and state means that there's no tax money collected that will go towards the support or subsidizing of a religious organization. This is really important because the state church existed in Europe. So taxes were collected even from people who did not belong to the state religion. In Germany, it would be like Lutheranism. Uh, England, it was the Anglican Church, right? And so you collected taxes, even if you were Muslim, and you had to pay taxes, and the tax money went to support a religion that you are not a part of, right? And there are a lot of other complications, but I won't get into it. So here in the United States, they said, okay, no separation of church and state. Tax money will not be used to subsidize a state religion or any religion at all. But of course, this gets muddied because of a bad definition of religion. So now people can legislate their morality. So everyone who, even people who don't subscribe to climate change or windmills or electric cars, yeah, we have to pay for that, right? And so that's the problem of legislating morality. And I got into that in episode 7. But this episode, I want to talk about the governmental structures within the actual religion. And back in the day when I would teach classes like Religion in the World, Religion in America, it was kind of boring, right? So I would say, oh, here's Hinduism, and this is what they believe. And so I thought it was just kind of boring, but I did it. But then I added a twist, and the twist was, if we examine the governmental structure of the religion, what might we find? And so the premise goes that governmental structures within religion function much in the same way as secular religions, like countries, right? Nationalities, nationalism. So within a country, you have a government, and the more power and authority that they have, the more corrupt they get, the more they become more about protecting themselves, the leadership, rather than seeking what is best for the people who are part of that religion, aka country, right? And the reason is because we're all human beings, right? Because we're all human, patterns generally emerge. Especially when the dynamics or the structure is very similar to something else, then it should not be surprising to anyone that you will find similar problems in governmental structures and religious organizations. So let's look at a couple of religions, right? Islam, which is 23% of the world, there are only 3 major sects: Sunni, Shia, and Sufi. I won't get into the breakdown of what they are, but Sunni is the vast majority, like over 80%. Shia is a much smaller. All right, fine. Sunni, they're the people after Muhammad dies. Okay, they're the ones who follow Muhammad's father-in-law after Muhammad dies. Okay, and so Sunni literally means tradition. Shia, they're the ones who decided that they were going to follow Muhammad's son-in-law, right? And so Shia literally means partisans for Ali. Now, each of those 2 traditions, they have different variations and stuff, but just so you know, that's where they came from, and that's why certain countries like Iraq and Iran are really kind of not, historically speaking, they don't get along with each other, right? And they're constantly at war, and it's because of that, of who they decided to follow. Even hundreds of years later, that continues, okay? Sufis are the mystics, and what I thought was kind of interesting is that all religions have a mystical tradition within it. And in Islam, Sufis generally tend to be kind of significant because Saudi Arabia, the dominant form of Islam there, is mystical, right? Wahhabi, I think, is what it's called to. Keep in mind, though, that Islam is not monolithic. As much as the news in America, the mass media will try to simplify Islam for everyone here in America, extremely diverse, even though there are only three major sects. But within each sect, there is a tremendous amount of diversity in terms of practice, adherence to belief, etc. So, for example, most people don't know this, which is why I'm going to put it in here. But the largest Muslim country is not in the Middle East; it's in Asia. And then I asked students, can you guess what the country is? And so, People are like, wait, there's a big Asian country in Asia? Oh, wow. Hey, how about India? Nope, not India. It's Indonesia, right? So Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world, right? And the largest Middle Eastern country is Egypt, and they're number 6, right? So India, Pakistan, oh, maybe Bangladesh, but so other countries are far larger and have many more Muslims than in the Middle East. So it's Egypt, Iran, and Turkey become 6th, 7th, and 8th largest Muslim countries. Okay. But if you go to Indonesia, you don't see this Islam being practiced in the same way that you see it in the Middle East. And you know what? A curious thing, because of US foreign policy of nation building, right? Undermining governments, destabilizing countries, and then trying to install their own puppet governments in these countries. What they've done is, what the United States has succeeded in doing is radicalized a lot of these countries. And so it's actually the religious conservative sects, right? Where all the women have to wear hijab and all this other kind of stuff. That's when it becomes, it's because of what the United States has done that you have that kind of religious expression in a lot of Middle Eastern countries. It's the United States. It's because of the United States and their meddling. Because in Indonesia, they've already had a couple of female presidents, right? And you wouldn't see that in Saudi Arabia. So that's something to bear in mind. But there are only 3 major sects, as the textbooks say it. Okay, so strong governmental structure, very little in terms of large sects, diversity in terms of sect. Okay, Hinduism, complete contrast, 14% of the world, no central governing body. I mean, you'll try to have some people elevated as being more knowledgeable than everybody else. Certain personalities become more known than others, like Mahatma Gandhi. But otherwise, there is no central governing body of Hinduism, right? No one to sit there and say, that's wrong. That's not Hinduism. That's not true Hinduism. You don't have that. And so therefore, there are so many different expressions of Hinduism. So if you go to India, for example, each household has its own god that it would that household would worship, right? And so there's so many, like some people will say thousands of gods. I have a feeling that some of those gods are just the same but with different names. Okay, but given the history, which is thousands of years long, it even goes back further behind recorded history. And the problem, of course, is that some of the original writings no one can read. At least in the West, no one knows what it says. And apparently most of the people in India don't know how to read it as well. And so then you have a lot of questions, right? But no central governing body. And so you have a huge variety of expressions of Hinduism, which also makes Hinduism very syncretistic. In other words, it doesn't reject certain beliefs as being wrong, but rather incorporates it as part of its religion, right? And so one extreme example would be the Sikhs, and Sikhs are people who practice a mixture of Islam and Hinduism. Buddhism even comes out of Hinduism. So that's a kind of an interesting thing. So here we see very little government structure and a wide range of beliefs. For people in the West who have a hard time getting their head around this, scholars have basically reduced Hinduism to just simply being karma, reincarnation, and yoga. Then if we come to Christianity, there's 2 large groupings of Christianity. You got the Catholics and the Protestants. And what's really interesting is that Catholics, there's just basically Catholics, right? Moving forward, there's the Vatican I, Vatican II, and then you have pre-Vatican II Catholics. You have lots of different varieties that way, but essentially the church structure is largely the same. So you got the Pope in Rome, and then everybody else is more or less affiliated with the Catholic Church. Interesting. So you have a very strong governmental structure, but it's been around for so long, and especially in Western society where there's so much research and innovation and whatnot, that a lot of ideas or theological doctrine, if you want to use that expression, right? So what they have described to be the right belief, the official right belief, well, it runs into problems every now and again. But so what do? Either you give way to this new information and thereby undermine the authority of the church, of the Pope, or you double down on your sort of dated or now inadequate belief. All right. So one instance of this, which is really significant, was the Galileo problem. So Galileo said, hey, the Earth actually revolves around the sun, right? Heliocentrism. And the church at the time was teaching that the Earth was the center of the universe, which, if you know Einstein really well, then it's not wrong. But anyway, but strictly speaking, in the geocentric understanding of the universe, that's what it was. The Earth was the center and the sun would revolve around the Earth. Galileo says, no, that's not it. And so then now what do? The church has been saying, hey, the Earth is the center of the universe. Now you have this guy saying, no, that's not true. So do you give in to this new information or do you double down on your own? And so that's the problem. If your authority depends on maintaining certain beliefs, then you have to maintain those beliefs. And so what happens is you have problems throughout society. You start arresting people, you start imprisoning people, you start calling them heretics and things like that. Yeah. Look at Protestants, right? So if you look at the Protestants, okay, these are the people who say, oh, whoa, all this time we haven't really been reading scripture, right? Hebrew Christian scripture, Old and New Testament. We haven't been reading it. And so we just trusted you in terms of what it said. But now that we have translations of scripture, it's no longer in Hebrew and Greek or Latin. Now we can read it in our own language. Hey, it doesn't say what you've been saying it says. And so now anyone who can read scripture can have their own interpretation. So originally you have the Protestant Reformation, where a lot of people split away from the Catholic Church. You got Martin Luther, you got John Calvin, a whole host of people. And they break away from the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church is militarily very weak at the time, and so they could pull this off. There were wars, but nevertheless, they were able to break away. And so you have these certain religious traditions, but there are many of them. Now you come to the United States, where there is no government regulations protecting one or another religion, at least today, there is no. So what you see is that each congregation, each church building potentially becomes its own breakaway sect. I'm actually a pastor too. I have my own congregation that I preach to. And in my community, if you don't like what the preacher is preaching, you leave the church and you find a church that says the things that you think are right. Or if you can't find anything like that, you start your own church. Literally, I'm not exaggerating at all, not one bit. And so what you see with Protestant churches is an attempt to have some sort of structure, governing body, which will declare what is right or wrong. But since it's voluntary, right? So it's a voluntary association. If you don't like what's being said, you just leave. And what this does is it sets up this phenomena where a lot of preachers and teachers try to cater to the demands of the congregation, right? So the obligation is not to try to be to teach what you think it means, but to sort of adapt it and craft it in a way that it meets the expectations of the people in your congregation. Why is that? Because it's not government subsidized. And so your salary depends on how many people are showing up to church. And if everyone leaves, then how are you going to make your money? And so you begin to see this uh, relationship, maybe not in your church denomination, but in my world where I see, so this non-white, non-large denomination supported ministry, uh, you have to fight to get people to show up to church so that they contribute to the operation of the church. And so that's where also your part of your salary comes from. And so people know this. And so if you're not going to give them what they want, they look for another church or they start their own, right? Very entrepreneurial, if you think about it. I always tell people that running a church is like running a small business or a big business, well, medium, mid-sized business, whatever, depending on your, if you go to Korea, they have mega churches, right? Uh, one church says they have like 1 million members. Okay, so we're talking about a kind of a business phenomena. So how do you get more people through the door? That kind of thing. And so in that kind of situation, then, doctrine, teaching it right becomes a challenge, you see. All right, so is this a problem? Is this wrong? Is there a solution? What do we do? Now, personally, I do have an opinion, but given that this is the Subjective Professor podcast, we have to realize that all subjectivities have a cost, right? And so in a religion that tries to hold on to a certain doctrine, a certain theological doctrine, over time, as times change, as technology changes, as learning grows, a lot of beliefs become challenged. And so then people who want to maintain those beliefs, it has to be a choice. And if they can't make a convincing argument or people are unwilling to believe it, then that is the cost, right? There is a cost to belief. I've mentioned this several times already. And so to say certain things, to say you believe certain things has a risk. There is a price attached to it. And so one can double down to protect a belief because you believe it's true, but understand that protecting an interpretation, a doctrine, a dogma, a theological position, it can go well or it can be abused. I've seen it many, many times. And so the thing about America, which is why I don't really worry about it so much, not only because I believe that, whatever happens is up to God, but also religion has to always be voluntary. I mean, if what you're doing doesn't make sense, if what you're teaching doesn't work, it doesn't hold water, it doesn't explain what people are going through, then they have a right to go look for something else, rightly or wrongly, for better or worse. But I personally believe that if everyone is seriously committed to learning, not just to find what is most convenient for that person, not to sort of justify a certain kind of behavior, but if people had a sincere attitude to learn more, to resolve contradiction, to resolve issues and try to reconcile what they believe in religious organization with what they see in the world, then things get worked out. And much like in the economic world, bad beliefs are untenable because they're just too expensive, right? And so you'll have few adherents to it, to that belief. But if something makes sense and something works, then no matter what happens, and no matter how many people believe, many or few, you're going to continue to believe those things that you believe is true. And eventually, I think, over time, especially as society changes very, very quickly and dramatically and a lot, then you'll see that certain beliefs will persist and reveal themselves as being better or more true, subjectively speaking, than others. But we need to have that sincere learning. And the only way that you can practice that desire to learn more is that we need to have freedom. We need to have a free society where there is no censorship, where there is a free exchange of ideas, where there is dialogue, so we can talk to people with different subjectivities and try to figure out what is the best explanation. And that's it for this episode. So I will see you in the next one.